Do you get totally overwhelmed by your emotions to the point where you feel they're taking over everything and you can't cope, which is a horrible feeling? Or are you on the opposite end of the spectrum where you push down your emotions, you suppress them to the point where maybe you feel totally numbed out? Maybe you have no idea how you're feeling. And that's not really a good feeling either. And then there's also some people who suppress their emotions, push them down, and then at some point the emotions explode all over the place. So, all three of those are examples of emotional dysregulation. And this is really common. All of us are emotionally dysregulated at times, but improving how often you can stay emotionally regulated can really improve your life. So, we're going to talk today about what emotional dysregulation is, and therefore, we'll also talk about what emotional regulation is. We'll talk about why it's important, what it means for you, and then I'm going to give you a very helpful process to understand in order to improve your emotional regulation. So, emotional regulation is the process of managing your emotions to maintain some balance and to respond appropriately to the challenges in your life. I think that's the definition of emotional regulation that I find the most useful. So, emotional dysregulation is a state in which we feel unbalanced, we don't feel balanced, and we can't respond effectively to situations. Our emotional arousal is just way too strong or non existent, neither of which help us to effectively deal with stress, effectively deal with conflict, choose which behaviors will be the most helpful for us in the long term. And of course, the actual experiential feelings are horrible. So, a super helpful way to think about this, in my view, is that we all have a zone of tolerance for emotions. And you can think of it as, and I'll show a picture here on the screen, but basically, our emotions are going to go up and down. We don't want to ignore them, we don't want to suppress them. But when they get too high, when they get outside the zone of tolerance, that's where we might be like way too anxious, way too stressed. We can't sleep at night. If we tend towards mania, we might engage in behaviors that are very destructive for us in the long run. But those would be examples of hyperarousal. And then when we get too low, which is hypoarousal, we shut down. We might be very depressed. We might be unable to function. We might sleep too much, feel numbed out. This is sort of the freeze mode, right? Of the fight, flight, and freeze. Fight and flight are way up here in the hyper arousal, and freeze is in the hypoarousal. And where we function best, where we generally even just feel best, because I know not everything is about how we function, although it does help our lives move forward more smoothly. But generally, where we end up feeling the best on an ongoing basis is in this zone of tolerance where we are somewhat more balanced while still having some mood swings. Our moods change many times during the course of a day, right? Almost everybody's. Little things happen, it shifts your mood, right? That's okay as long as it stays within this zone of tolerance. So, the topic of emotional regulation and dysregulation is actually enormous, and I am going to do a series of videos on this. So, you can definitely pop any questions you have in the comments. I do read those and look for, ideas for future videos. But I am going to elaborate on some of the points that I'm going to make right now in next week's video. So, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button if you're getting value out of this, and then tune in next week. But let's talk about why emotional regulation matters. So, in all sorts of scientific research and psychological research, the ability to manage one's emotions effectively and respond effectively to the emotions you're having has been tied to well being in all sorts of areas. Now, this doesn't mean necessarily happiness, right? We're not aiming for one particular emotional state. We are going to have moods, but to be able to have those within a zone that we can tolerate and still function and still move forward and achieve what we want to do in life, have the relationships we want to have, right? That's what contributes to our mental well being. And so, one of the things that emotional regulation or dysregulation does is that it impacts what strategies we use to cope with the emotions we're having, and then what consequences those strategies have. So, psychotherapists like myself will use terms like maladaptive coping strategies and adaptive coping strategies. But what that basically means, a maladaptive coping strategy is not effective at achieving what you want to achieve, or it has some major backlash and negative impact on you later. Whereas adaptive coping strategies are those that are reasonable responses to the situation and overall contribute to behaviors and outcomes that will end up keeping you emotionally regulated. So that's the other thing to think about the maladaptive versus adaptive strategies is that they contribute to either a solution or a problem. So the maladaptive strategies, and I'm going to give you some specifics here in just a second, are going to make the emotional dysregulation worse and worse. So, what are some examples of maladaptive coping strategies that go with emotional dysregulation? One is avoiding people or places that bring up uncomfortable emotions. Instead of learning how to deal with those uncomfortable emotions or change what you can about a situation or change how you think about a situation, you just avoid it. And avoiding situations, I talk in a lot of my anxiety videos, avoiding something that makes you anxious is only going to make your anxiety worse and make your world smaller and smaller. And I'm not talking about like avoiding skydiving, which none of us need to do. And actually, it might fall into the next maladaptive strategy, but really avoiding those things that help us function and lead reasonable lives. So, the second maladaptive coping strategy I want to talk about is excessive risk taking. That's why I said jumping out of an airplane could fall into this. Not always. I am not criticizing that. There was a point in my life I wanted to do it, but I never did it. But anyway, excessive risk taking can be an effort to deal with uncontrollable emotions that you're having, and it can have extreme backlash effects. A corollary to that one is engaging in illegal drugs or too much alcohol or utilizing medications that are biphasic. They swing your emotions. So you take one because you want to swing in the other direction, and maybe you take a different one to swing back. But long term, they are not going to help you emotionally regulate. Another maladaptive coping strategy could be really externalizing your emotions, acting out in rage at your job site, for example, not going to be helpful for you long term. Going into a rage at home, not going to help your relationship with your loved ones. So, externalizing the excessive anger or rage is a way to release it, but not a helpful one. And then there's the internalizing the emotions, which could lead to behaviors like cutting, eating disorders, rumination, sort of a different angle on that, but really incredibly negative self talk or going over and over and over something, way too much anxiety. That could be internalizing the uncomfortable emotions. So, I promised to share a model of how to think about emotional regulation that can help you improve yours. And this model was developed by James J. Gross from the Department of Psychology at Stanford University. And this model has really changed how a lot of research is done about emotional regulation and how people think about it. But the model basically says that emotions develop from a situation that we're in, what we pay attention to within that situation, and then how we think about the situation, and that's what leads to an emotional response to the situation. And emotions have sort of three components in this model. I always talk about emotions having a physical feeling, a physiological feeling, as well as an experiential feeling of the emotion. And in this model, they also include your behavioral response, the behaviors you exhibit or don't exhibit based on that emotion. So the situation, what you pay attention to, how you think about it, all creates your emotional response. And then your emotional response acts back on that situation. It has an impact on that situation, and the cycle continues. So in James Gross's model, he looks at 5 points of intervention. So one is choosing the situation, and I do want to come back to that one. The next is whether you can modify that situation. So if you're in a situation and it seems like it's going to lead to a particular emotional response, can you modify it? And then what can you pay attention to within that situation? So where you put your attention, that is something that as you practice, you can think about this beforehand and control and think about where you want to put your attention. And then how you think about all of it, the cognitive appraisal or reappraisal, another important point for intervening, and then the emotional response. And in James Gross's theory, the hardest place to intervene is after you've already had the emotional response. The interventions that take the most effort and are the least effective are the ones after you've already been triggered and your emotions have already been created. So I want to come back to the choosing of the situation because I don't want it misinterpreted about avoiding. So, yes, if there's a situation that makes you anxious and you avoid it, long term, it's going to make things worse. But let's take a different example in terms of choosing a situation. So, an example that's near and dear to my heart is choosing a movie or TV show to watch before I go to bed. If I watch anything too activating, I will not get to sleep for quite a while in the evening. If I watch something that's sort of mellow, maybe even a little boring, nature documentaries, that can be helpful. I will go to sleep much more easily. So if I want to have an impact on my emotional arousal and my physiology, I can choose what movie to watch or what TV show to watch. So that is choosing a situation that you know will be beneficial for what you want to accomplish. And then the second place to intervene, situation modification. Let's say you're really, really upset about something, but you just want to go out with a friend who makes you laugh and you don't want to talk about it. And you go out and you meet the friend, and then the friend asks about the difficult situation. Can you respond with, I really don't want to talk about it. Really just want you to make me laugh tonight. I really just want to have a good time. That is you impacting the situation with your desired emotional state in mind. And it could be the opposite. You could be like, no, I really want to meet with a friend who's going to let me talk about what I'm upset about because we can process our emotions sometimes effectively through talking about them. So that's both choosing your situation and then modifying your situation. And then what do you pay attention to? Let's say you're going to a family event and there's a couple of people in your family who argue politics. It gets you really, really upset. Before you go, make a concerted effort that you are not going to pay them attention and you will do what you can to pay attention to the family members you find easier to deal with, the children who are there. Maybe you can create a game to play with the kids, right? You can decide ahead of time how to set things up so that you are paying attention to the things that are not going to trigger you into an overblown emotional state. And then the fourth point of intervention, which is the cognitive appraisal or reappraisal, this is how you think about something, right? So you're in a job interview and it's not going very well. Instead of cognitively being like, oh, I'm not going to get this job. I I'm lousy, I'm not good enough, everything is lousy in my life, you could be like, well, this does not feel like a fit. Maybe it's a bummer. I wasted time coming here, but maybe there's something I can learn. But I'm learning what is not going to work for me. So that would be a way of it's basically how can you see the situation differently? And that can bring in all sorts of the like cognitive distortions and how do you recognize them, and I do have a bunch of videos on those. But if you find yourself distorting events with your thoughts in a way that makes your emotions worse, this is an area to spend some time. And then the fifth place, which we said is the one that takes a lot of effort. This is after you're in a full blown emotional upheaval, a fight, flight, or freeze response. There are effective techniques for calming yourself down physiologically, but they work way better if you practice them regularly. If you practice them not when you're in the middle of being emotionally upset. So I know with this topic, I'm just scratching the surface of it, but I think it is useful to understand the process model and to think about kind of slow your process and your awareness of your own emotional responses down so that you can piece these things out. What was the situation? Did you have control over it or not? What did you pay attention to within that situation? How did you think about it? And then how did you respond? All right, if you could let me know if this was useful, I would greatly appreciate it. I do have a bunch of other videos that would be useful on this topic, so do check them out, different playlists. I'll pop a few here, and I look forward to seeing you next week.